What are men like and what does it mean to be a man? We all have our assumptions, our expectations, and our projections around masculinity. In today's video, we're going to be breaking down these two books and two more books on masculine psychology to help you identify and eventually heal your father wound. We're going to look at the father wound and the father complex from a mainly depth psychology perspective, but I'm also going to do something pretty important. I'm going to unplug you from the psychiatric language. I'm going to try and create some distance between all of these diagnostic labels of narcissism or attachment issues or various obsessive compulsive, bipolar, whatever it might have been, isms, and focus on your experience as a child of your literal father on a very easy but also very insightful framework that will help you to heal your relationships with adult men as the adult that you are. This video is highly practical, but it's deeply philosophical. I'm going to try and make it also as subjectively appropriate as possible. If you've seen my previous video on the mother wound, you'll see that I brought out a 3-part framework for identifying the mother complex and the mother archetype and the mother wound by extension. We're applying the exact same framework here. Both of these videos go together, like the ideal father and the ideal mother, or maybe the negative father and the negative mother in the particular hellscape of the overly abusive family. Whatever your experience might be, we're going to look at those wounds in detail, but through the lens of emotion, not through dead language that you found on Google. Fundamentally, to understand the father wound means to understand men. And if you have a broken image of your father because he was an incomplete or broken man, he was either never around or around too much, don't be surprised. Don't be shocked if you fail to have healthy relationships with men in your adult life if you haven't done the healing work. And really easy way to go into this is fundamentally the same thing I did over on the mother wound video. So if you've seen that one already, it's the same exact framework. It applies for both parents. What's the temperature? What's the proximity? And what's the intensity? Did you have a hot father who was burning with warmth or burning with rage? Or was he a cool father who was icy cold and detached, or maybe calming because you were too warm of a child? You're a bit of a firework kid and you're always bouncing off the walls, and he was calm, he was cool, he was collected, and it was loving. Or was he ice cold? Cold to the touch, never, ever give you a hug. Different temperatures, right? A hot father, a cold father. That's metric number 1. Metric number 2, how close were they to you when you were a small person? Was he way too close in a sense of he was smothering and constricting and he was always intruding on yourself? Or was he close in a way of giving you the hug when it's appropriate, being loving and caring? He'd open the door and go, I see what you're doing. That's good. Good job. Keep it up. And then off you'd go and you'd feel a sense of pride because dad's around and dad's doing a good job. Or unfortunately for many of us, and this is something which is more of a recent phenomenon in the last 30 years, it's actually the opposite end of the spectrum. The absent father, the father who wasn't there, the father who was never there. We're children of divorces. Many of us, statistically speaking, come from broken families. Either the parents were in conflict and they were not quite gelling in, it never quite worked out, so there were all of these tensions and explosions within their relationship and it affected you as a child. That might have been the scenario, but also a very common scenario, the father's distant. And again, you apply these two principles together. What does it mean to have a hot but distant father? It depends on the type of heat. This is where we're getting a bit metaphorical, but you can also look back on your literal memory as a child. If he was a warm, loving, but distant father, this could be a situation where you were in a divorce and you stayed with your mother, you only saw him on every other weekend, but when you did see him, he left a very loving, warm impression, and you naturally want to move towards masculinity. Of course, that has an implication towards the kinds of men that you build friendships with, or if you're a woman, the kinds of men that you want to date and fall in love with. If you have a positive impression, a positive father image, even if he was at a distance, it doesn't have to be close. Arguably, in terms of classical psychology, it's more of the mother's role to be closer to the young child, and the father, by natural situations in most family homes, he's out in the world, he's doing things. It's not a comment on what's the ideal situation for any particular child. It's just a general pattern for most people who will be watching videos like this in their adult life. They were generally in closer proximity to their mother, and their father was far away. He could be far in a loving sense, or he could be far in a hot but burning and angry sense. Maybe he was the father that was never around, he was always working too much at the office, but when you saw him, Occasionally, a few times a week, he'd come back, he'd be asleep before he comes back. We'd see him on the weekend. He was explosive in his anger, and he did not leave a good impression. What kind of psychology would that create for you as a child? Just think about these questions. You already have your blueprint in place, and yet this final proximity and temperature connection must be complemented by a third aspect, and that's the intensity. How high charge, how low charge, because if you have a very hot father who's very high charge and very close, that is a world of overwhelm. The small boy or the small girl cannot deal with that much negatively charged energy, and normally you check out. You either have to force to fight back and you become a bit of a bully, usually at school. That's a byproduct. You can't fight back, so you have to take that punching and that fighting energy elsewhere. Or for most small boys and small girls, that big man is too much, so you don't want to take the verbal or physical beatings. You shrink out and you leave your body if the abuse was there. That's a man who's way too hot, way too close, way too negative, way too high charge. What if he's lower charge? Maybe it doesn't happen as frequently, or maybe when he does get up in your face, it's very short-lived. It's like a fuse that crackles and then diminishes. He'll shout once and then make a vague threat that trails off into nothing because he hasn't got the follow-through. It's a whoosh kind of feeling. Many different patterns. Alternatively, low charge father. Whole nother example. The cold, distant, low charge father. He is a ghostly, spectral figure in the home or outside of the home. He barely exists. He could be very overweight, he could be very underweight. It doesn't really matter what the physical composition is. Usually, if the father doesn't exist in this way, he's usually very, very skinny. He may be hooked on substances of one form or another. He may be dissociated himself. He might be checked out with television. He's just not there. He's not material. You can't form a relationship with him. And again, thinking through that lens, how does that impact your relationships with other men in your adult life, or with your son, or with male colleagues, male employees? All of these patterns, this particular father wound creates an energetic imprint. It creates a nervous system memory. It's a vague term to a degree, but if you really wanted to go into literature, you can see that the nervous system is encoded by the early experiences during the developmental ages from both the mother and the father, especially during those first 8 years, and you will not escape that conditioning by simply trying to move on without doing some proper rewiring work. But people can sometimes get this wrong. At a cognitive level, you need to understand masculine psychology and the many faces of the masculine, the many temperatures, proximities, and intensities. And I've got a few books I'm going to share with you in just a moment to go into that in a bit more detail. We'll recap the first two and then introduce two more. Before you leave the video, though, I want you to have an understanding that the father is not a singular father. I made this point in the mother wound video. You were 0, you were 1, you were 2, you were 3, you were 4, you were 5, you were 6, all the way to 18, those 18 years of childhood. Was your father the same father throughout all of those years? That's what we need to come back to on a practical level, because then we can change the many faces of the father based on a literal timeline going all the way back into your personal history. Let's look at the books first. These are books I recommend you read. They're not the full selection. You can see this shelf over here. That's my masculine feminine shelf. There's about 40 books on there. There's another 20 odd over here. I've read a lot on masculine and feminine psychology, mainly from a Jungian lens, but also from a mythical, archetypal, and some modern stuff as well. I mean, the shelf down here, that's all romance and dating. So there's another 40 odd books there on what people do, what adults do when they're left alone in a bedroom together, where it goes right, where it goes wrong. It's still father energy, mother energy, and of course, conception, generativity. We need to understand these things. For the sake of our partners, for the sake of our families, for the sake of our friends. One of the books I want you to recommend to me. We'll turn it around. Now you have to do the videos on those jokes. Have a good video, and then you have to return it back to me. Anyway, What Men Are Like. Fantastic book. It's really good as an overall therapeutic book as well. You can see the wounding of man and how therapists work with the wounds of men to make things better. And this will actually unlock a bit of compassion for your father. If you're a woman especially, and you haven't yet healed your relationship to the masculine, you feel like men are unsafe or they're something that's beneath you, read a book like this. Do yourself a favor, do your future partner a favor, do your current partner a favor, do your son a favor. Because if you don't heal your relationship to your own father, you're going to show up in unconscious, shadowy ways towards your own son, and you're going to have assumptions about who he is because he's a man. So do some therapeutic work, do it ahead of time. If you want a more accessible introduction, again, to Be a Man, this fantastic essay collection. It's a variety of contributors, dozens and dozens of incredible teachers, bringing many perspectives on the masculine. And of course, we can't look at the masculine archetypes without the classic You Know It's Coming, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. I've held this book up at least 10 times on the channel. It is the book on the masculine archetypes in their light form and their shadow form. You're going to understand rulership, you're going to understand romance and beauty, you're going to understand intelligence, articulation, and of course you're going to understand the hard-charging, business-minded, warrior-esque man as well, and many, many, many sub-variants. And if you want to go back to the original literature, well, at least somewhat original, 2,500 years ago, you can look at Gods and Every Men by Jean Shinoda Bolen, and this is an understanding of the male archetypal figures from Greek and Roman antiquity. Same concept, but just gone through a few different myths. And of course, if you're interested in learning about the feminine as well, which you should be, you can also pick up Goddesses in Every Woman. The book looks exactly the same. If you go on Amazon, you'll see both of them come together. I recommend that all men and all women read both of those books. That's a theoretical stack for you to go and explore in your own time. For the sake of this video, to make it practical, I want you to understand, as we mentioned just a moment ago, that you are not a single child and your father was not a single man. He was a different type of man depending on the situations that you went through as a family. And your image of him as a man, your experience of him as a father, isn't as full as you might assume. And this is where you can go into really intermediate to advanced territory in healing your father wound. The first stage is having an understanding that, okay, roughly speaking, I had something like our overly hot father. He was kind of middle ground in distance, and he was really inconsistent on the intensity. That was my father. Or, alternatively, he was really cool, really distant. I never saw him. I didn't see him in 5 years. That was my father. Yes, that was your father. But at what age are you thinking of when you make that example? Are you thinking of yourself in a particular setting, a particular home that you lived in, a particular situation? What about the other years? When I work with clients, we come into this classic moment of mother wound and father wound recognition. When I say, aha, yes, that is your mother. That's very well summarized, Mr. or Mrs. Client. Bravo, you've captured that in perfect words. Now, what happened 5 years earlier? What happened 5 years later? Very, 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 very rarely will the image remain the same without a shift in one direction or another direction, because the mother or the father who was the mother or the father for you when you were 10 years old in the particular conditions of you as a 10-year-old, maybe you were changing school, maybe you were changing home, maybe there was a death of a family pet, maybe there was a situation where the parents were in conflict or something was happening in regards to a brother or a sister, or so many life situations. And because your father was one man, he responded based on what he had available to him at the time. So he may have been that overly distant, overly cold, never to be heard from father, but only after the divorce at age 12. And you forgot those first 12 years. Or maybe he was way too intense, way up in your face, but actually everything changed at age 6 when he went to therapy. But your impression of him, because it was so negative, he was physically, verbally abusive, and he went really hard on you for those first 6 years. You remember him for the kind of work that he was back then, and you don't see what's changed. You don't see what's changed in the adult life in the decades since those moments. And of course, you can't forgive and you can't forget. And that's a whole other concept in itself. But just see how the image of the father changes over time, and know that you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't see the opportunity to change your image based on who he actually was, not your memory of the easiest possible entry point. Either, yes, he was all bad, or all good, because then you're locked in pedestalization, angelic, demonic. You're caught in a shallow level of inner work. You're still doing genuine inner work, but next stage, next level is to understand versatility over time, and also to understand if you had siblings, see how your father related to brother or sister versus you. Every father is trying their best. At least we have to believe that they're trying their best. Otherwise, I'm not sure why they became a father in the first place. And many fathers have a distinctly different approach to their son or their daughter, especially when things start to become adolescent. A father's relationship to a 13-year-old daughter is very different from his relationship to the 3-year-old daughter. Same with the son. The son's 16, he's starting to get testy, or maybe there's some extra combat in the household. Maybe you're taller than him for the first time, you weigh more than him, you're more athletic. There's that feeling of power imbalance for the first time. That changes things, but that never usually happens with a daughter. That kind of physical father-son archetypal story of, are you going to take on the father and overthrow the tribal kingdom? That doesn't happen. So there's a very different psychology underneath the surface, of course. When things go wrong is very deeply inappropriate and disgusting relationships between father and daughter, which I can't say the words on YouTube, but those kinds of things where the emotions go too far and the physicality goes too far. Men make these terrible, terrible, sinful, satanic choices with their daughters, but they also make the same with their sons. But it's usually in a different direction, and this is where things get pretty cold and pretty dark. If one of the wounds in our society is that the shadow man or the shadow father is too close to the daughter in a way which is deeply inappropriate, the shadow man, for many of the men that I work with, was too distant from their son. Many men that I work with don't remember a loving embrace, or a loving word, or a genuine moment of respect and warmth from father to son. They went in the opposite direction. The collective shadow father is split between inappropriateness, way too close, way too distant, way too warm, way too cold, the intensity. You see the whole thing coming together. This framework of heat and proximity and intensity, mother, daughter, father, son. There's so many different elements in your story. If you watch both the videos that I've put out, this one and the other one on the mother wound, and you can flesh out a story of your childhood from age 0 to age 18, how they changed, how they evolved, how they devolved, how they regressed, you'll get a crystal clear understanding of where the wounds still remain. And this practically will give you an insight into how to heal your relationship with other men. As an adult man with your adult male friends, you'll be able to work on some of those unconscious, competitive, combative dynamics, or the fact that you don't have male friends or close male friends, or you just like having female friends, or you're just lost in one romantic situation after another, and you're always going for these short-term affairs or weekend flings, and you haven't got deep, sustained connection. It goes back into father wound. Believe it or not, your relationship to women goes back to your father wound, because you saw examples of how your father related to women. And to some degree, most of us, unless we've done conscious work, we will repeat the unconscious choices of our father until the light penetrates the darkness. That will apply to how we treat women, that will apply to how we treat our children, and of course it will apply to our relationships with other men, especially, this is crucial, especially if you have memories of your father at the age that you are now. So men who are in their 30s or 40s, maybe they have memories of when their father was 35 and now they're 35, and you're relating to other 35-year-old men. There's so much unconscious story there. You might start seeing what these men are doing in their 30s, and you have this unconscious, completely out of contact image of your abusive 35-year-old father who, whatever it might be, those stories can be there. And the same for women who are interested in doing this work, healing their father wound. Obviously, it has major implications on their romantic life. The majority of women who grow up into healthy, conscious, wonderful women choose healthy, conscious, wonderful partners. But those who grow up and they seem more or less healthy, they become a mature woman, but they choose these dreadful, poisonous partners in almost every situation. As cliche as it is, it's because they haven't healed their father wound. They're going with what feels comfortable. And inversely, I've also worked with female clients who were very much daddy's little girl when they were younger, and they were loved and they were protected, and it didn't go into that inappropriate closeness. So they have a degree of respect and understanding for men, and I can see it quite clearly in some of the client work that I do. Some women, actually at this stage, I think, probably half a dozen different women have said this to me over the last 4 or 5 years, that I'm the first male therapeutic figure that they've ever worked with. Remember different women who'd been 5, 6, or 7 therapists deep. 2 different women had said this to me, that they were multiple therapists deep, and they'd all been women. And they realized, well, actually, you know what, I think 3 or 4 female therapists deep, I knew I needed to work with a man and have a man's perspective on these issues and have that male, compassionate, supportive energy, which is a different energy to a female compassion. I'm more structural, I'm more boundary-based, I'm more conditional in a hopefully supportive and affectionate sense, in a professional containment where there are yeses and nos, not the all forgiving kind of feminine classic style of healing. I do something a bit different because I'm a man and I also enjoy that style. Women come to me with very, 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 very bad images of what men are like, and in that 4-month space, I feel like I'm a representative of masculinity as a whole. I don't extend to the best of my ability. I don't extend a full pressure on myself to be the perfect example of men, but I try and bring new perspectives to the stories that they're sharing with me about what men were like, what their father was like, what their brother was like, what their relationships were like, what their ex-husband was like. And I open new insights in ways that they don't get from their female friends, from their mother, obviously from their mother. If they're talking about the father, usually there's this triangulation of like, you need to be on my side, not his side. These things happen. I work with these kinds of women, and I see that when they have a beautifully supportive, appropriate relationship with a man, sometimes for the first time, changes start to happen. I see them get into healthy relationships, and I check in 2 years later and they're still in that healthy relationship. It's not me as an individual. I'm not trying to toot my trumpet. I'm just saying that if you're in contact with healthy masculinity as a woman who wasn't in contact with that before, you can change the pattern. You change it in terms of your romantic relationships, and also on the inverse side, if you were way too involved in masculine things, you grew up with, say, just your father and your mother was out of the picture, it could be worthwhile for you to go and seek out a female therapist. This is another group of my female clients. They've never worked with a female therapeutic figure or a female coach or a female teacher because some unconscious belief is in there that women are weak, women aren't as intelligent, women aren't as useful. There's all kinds of internal feminine hating because they over-bonded with the father. Many, many different patterns. What's important for you to focus on is looking at this framework of how hot, how cold, how close, how far, how intense, how low. Look at the consistencies and inconsistencies over an 18-year timeline and be willing to look in those gaps that appear in the journey where the story doesn't quite make sense. Why was he loving until this age? Why was he horrific at this time period? Why did my parents have a fight when I was at this age? You look at it and you sit with it, and then you understand men and him, and you understand yourself if you're a man, or you understand the men who you love and you're close to if you're a woman. You can also understand your inner man if you're a woman. This is a point that I made over on the mother wound video. Again, please do watch that if you haven't at the end of this video. You can look at your internal masculine. This idea that there's an internal animus figure from the classic Carl Jung terminology. You have a series of masculine qualities that are waiting to be expressed, waiting to be developed through relationship to outer men, but also through boundary making, rule making. There's classic masculine traits that the father represents. That's all there to be enjoyed. But it can't be unlocked if you're locked into an old pattern of the father wound. I've given everything I can for this single video. I can't give the precise answers. If you're looking for a final takeaway to really make this practical, understand that now as an adult, your father, your literal father, and whether he be living or whether he be dead, he is not the same man that your memory would place him as. Even if 95% of your memory was that he was a real work, he was a piece of so-and-so. There's moments in there. There's moments when he was laughing. There's moments when it was good. Small moments they might be, but just open up that possibility. In the same way, if you saw him as true perfection and you really were daddy's little girl, or you were, little buddy, or whatever it might be, the father-son relationship, he was your best friend, he was a superhero, look for that 5% of darkness. Look for that time where he lost his temper, that time where he went too far with his words or with his hand, and those moments. Build out the relationship and you won't be caught in projective fantasy. You won't be caught naive by the pitfalls that you fall into with the men in your life as an adult. And I hope that you read the books, but I hope that you also build that internal relationship to your inner man. And if you're a man, you become a better man as a result of knowing what didn't work and what you could do better for your children, for your partner, for your family, for your community. Fundamentally, we strengthen that divine masculine principle. We strengthen that divine feminine principle. If you don't want to get too mystical or too poetic, the mother, the father, you find them within. You build relationships with men and women who understand that balanced quality inside themselves, and the world gets a little bit better. But of course, we need to make sure that we're balanced out, so do go and watch the mother wound video. It's over here. Same principle, different examples, and it will also complement this. If you think you don't need to heal your mother wound because it's all your father's problem, just go and consider this video. It's well worth it.